"Sir, are you a carpenter?" The words hung in the crisp, cold air of the highway, absurd and nonsensical, yet possessing an undeniable weight that cut through the roaring silence that had settled around the mangled remains of my life. That was the very first thing the young state trooper said, his voice flat, almost accusatory, echoing the disbelief that contorted his clean-shaven face. He stood beside what had, mere moments before, been my reliable sedan, now a grotesque sculpture of twisted metal. It was not, "Are you all right, father?" Not, "My God, how did you survive?" Just that bizarre, utterly baffling question, dripping with a confusion that mirrored and somehow intensified my own profound disorientation. I stood there, feeling the wind's icy fingers tease the stray hairs at my temples, a faint tremor still coursing through my limbs. My car was indeed a twisted metal insult to engineering, compressed to half its original length against the unforgiving concrete guardrail, looking as if some giant fist had simply crushed it. The front end was an accordion of shredded steel, its engine block seemingly swallowed whole by the impact, or perhaps simply vanished. Beyond it, looming like a fallen titan, was the jackknifed semi-truck that had slammed into me, its trailer a crumpled, corrugated wave of aluminum, shimmering dully under the bruised twilight sky. Steam hissed from ruptured lines like an angry serpent's breath, painting ghost-like tendrils in the frigid air. Oil bled dark onto the cracked asphalt, staining the gray with an ominous, slick sheen. The air, heavy and metallic, was thick with the scent of burnt rubber, ruptured fuel, and something else, something profoundly out of place, an aroma that prickled at the edges of my comprehension, teasing a memory I couldn't quite grasp. Paramedics, their neon vests glowing with an almost otherworldly luminescence against the deepening gloom, moved with a kind of grim, practiced efficiency around the wreckage. Their faces, usually composed, bore expressions of a disbelief that transcended their professional masks. I heard their hushed murmurs, snippets of conversation that chilled me even in my dazed state. Physics-defying, incredible, unsurvivable impact. How is he even standing? They spoke of G-forces and velocity, using words I understood intellectually but which, at that moment, seemed utterly irrelevant to my impossible reality. Every fiber of their professional experience screamed that a body subjected to such an impact should be, at best, a broken mess beyond recognition, at worst, unidentifiable fragments. Yet, here I stood, Father Michael O'Connell, for 40 years a humble servant of God, now a ghost in a black suit, my breath misting visibly in the cold. No shattered bones, no lacerations, not even a bruise. My old clerical suit, the one I had worn to countless baptisms and funerals, to celebrate Mass and to comfort the dying, was indeed covered in a fine powdery dust. And it smelled. Oh, how it smelled. It smelled impossibly distinctly of freshly cut wood. Not the stale, comforting scent of old church pews, warmed by centuries of prayer, nor the scent of decaying leaves in an autumn forest. This was the vibrant, living scent of a lumberyard after a fresh delivery, of sawmills humming with industry, a rich tapestry of cedar and oak and something more ancient, more exotic, almost like olive wood. It was an aroma that defied the logic of this concrete highway, this catastrophe, this world. It was a scent that whispered of creation, not destruction, an ethereal counterpoint to the crude symphony of death and destruction that surrounded us. The trooper, a young man whose face was etched with a mixture of profound bewilderment and the dawning terror of professional disbelief, lowered his gaze from the monstrous wreck to me, then back to the scene as if hoping some forgotten detail would magically appear to rationalize the impossible. His gloved hand, steady despite the chaos, held something delicate, something dark and dense, with an almost luminous grain, strangely ancient-looking, yet undeniably freshly broken. A wood splinter. He held it up, not to me, but to the dying light, examining it as if it were an artifact from another dimension, a piece of a puzzle with no discernible solution. His lips moved, forming the question again, silently this time, but the meaning was clear in his wide, disbelieving eyes. "Sir, are you a carpenter?" How could I possibly explain? How could I articulate the impossible truth that hummed in my bones, the inexplicable grace that had shielded me from the very jaws of death? How could I tell him that the dust on my clothes, the scent in the air, and that very splinter in his hand were all fragments of a miracle so profound it made my very soul ache with a mixture of terror and an incandescent, terrifying joy? My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the scientific impossibility of my survival with the tangible evidence of my untouched body. They would try to explain it with science, with luck, with a fluke of the road, but they wouldn't understand. Not yet. The story of how I walked away from an accident that should have claimed my life begins right here, in this impossible tableau of twisted metal and unexplained timber. It begins with a carpenter's name, shouted into the void in my moment of utter despair. It begins with a priest who had lost his way, only to find himself saved by an event that would shatter his understanding of the physical world and forever redefine his faith. The impossible contradiction, the smell of wood where there should only be exhaust and oil, the splinter in the trooper's hand. These were not random details. They were the fingerprints of an unseen architect, the lingering scent of an intervention so profound, so utterly defying explanation, that it forced me to question everything I thought I knew about heaven and earth. This was not an accident. It was a conversation whispered by the divine, in a language only the heart could truly understand. And I, Father Michael O'Connell, have spent every day since struggling to translate it, to live up to the impossible gift I was given. Before the impossible contradiction, before the smell of wood where there should only have been exhaust and oil, before the splinter in the trooper's hand that spoke of an unseen architect, I was a man driving towards his own quiet surrender. The memory of that morning is etched into my soul not with the vivid colors of life, but with the muted grays of exhaustion. It was a Tuesday, a day of the week that now holds a particular poignancy for me, for it was the day I intended to lay down the cross I had carried for 40 years. 40 years. The words felt heavy, like wet wool, whenever I whispered them to myself. For 4 decades I had been Father Michael O'Connell, a parish priest in a small, increasingly secular town, nestled in the undulating landscape of our diocese. My journey had begun with such an incandescent flame of purpose, a youthful zeal that saw every soul as a potential convert, every sermon as a divine utterance, every prayer as a direct line to the heart of God. I remembered those early years, the earnestness in my voice, the boundless energy I poured into baptisms, weddings, and especially funerals, where I felt most acutely the sacred privilege of comforting the grieving. I had believed, truly believed, that I was a conduit, a vessel through which God's grace flowed unfettered into the world. But the world, dear friends, has a way of wearing down even the most zealous heart. Slowly, imperceptibly, like the ceaseless erosion of a riverbed, my conviction had begun to thin. St. Jude's, my beloved parish, which had once bustled with families and resonated with the joyful clamor of children, had grown quieter with each passing year. The pews, once filled to overflowing on a Sunday morning, were now cavernous spaces, vast expanses of polished wood, where only a scattering of faithful souls dared to brave the silence. The faces I saw were mostly older, their own faith a testament to a bygone era, their numbers dwindling with each passing winter. I would stand at the altar, the familiar liturgy a comforting rhythm that had lost its power to ignite, and look out at those few faces: Mrs. Henderson, a widow whose husband I had buried 2 decades ago, the 2 teenage altar servers, whose eyes often strayed to the clock, old Mr. Doyle, whose hearing aids whined softly. My sermons, once crafted with fervent prayer and intellectual rigor, now felt like echoes in a hollow space. The words, though still true, seemed to dissipate into the quietude of the nave, landing with a soft thud rather than a resounding chime. I would see polite nods, sometimes a glazed stare, rarely that spark of recognition, that sudden illumination in the eyes that told me a divine truth had pierced the veil of the mundane. It was humbling, yes, but more than that, it was profoundly disheartening. It felt like shouting into a storm that refused to acknowledge your presence. My own prayers, once the bedrock of my existence, had begun to feel like letters sent to an address I was no longer sure of. I'd kneel in the dim light of the rectory chapel, the scent of old incense and beeswax a familiar comfort, and try to reach out, to touch the hem of God's garment. But the connection felt tenuous, frayed. It wasn't that I stopped believing in God entirely. No, not that. It was more insidious, more subtle. I stopped believing that my prayers, my efforts, my weary soul truly mattered to Him. I felt like a tired old workman, meticulously tending a field that had long ceased to yield fruit, faithfully showing up for a job that had, perhaps, rendered itself obsolete. The crisis of faith that consumed me was not a dramatic, fiery struggle against doubt, like a theological wrestling match with an angel. No, it was a quiet, suffocating thing, a slow seep of spiritual weariness that had permeated every corner of my soul. It was the feeling that the wellspring had dried up, that the vibrant stream of grace I once felt flowing through me had dwindled to a trickle, then stopped altogether. My compassion, though still present for those who sought it, felt like a finite resource, constantly depleted. My hope, once an inexhaustible spring, was now just a shallow puddle reflecting a gray sky. I saw young priests burst forth from the seminary, full of fire and new ideas, and I felt nothing but a quiet envy, a deep understanding of the journey they were just beginning, a journey I no longer had the strength to continue. The decision to retire early had not come suddenly. It had brewed for months, a bitter tea steeped in loneliness and a growing sense of futility. I had reread my ordination vows countless times, the words a stark reminder of the enthusiastic young man who had pledged his life to God. I promised to exercise the ministry of the word, I had sworn, preaching the gospel and explaining the Catholic faith. Had I failed? Had the world simply changed too much for me to keep up? Or had I, in my quiet desperation, simply lost my voice? The letter, carefully worded and agonizingly written, was the physical manifestation of my defeat. It lay on the passenger seat beside me, a thin white envelope against the worn beige upholstery of my old sedan. I remember the feel of the paper under my fingertips as I placed it there that morning, cool, crisp, and heavy with the weight of 40 years of service ending in what felt like resignation. It was addressed to Bishop Davies, a kind man who had offered words of encouragement only a few months prior, trying to rekindle a spark he must have sensed was dimming. Now I was extinguishing it myself. The words, early retirement due to personal health reasons, were a gentle lie, a polite euphemism for my spirit is broken and I have nothing left to give. On the dashboard, slightly askew from a recent bump in the road, sat the small, hand-carved statue of a sleeping Saint Joseph. It was a gift from my mother, a devout woman who had prayed tirelessly for my vocation when I was first ordained. She had pressed it into my hand with a tearful smile, telling me, Michael, always remember Joseph. He listens in his dreams, and he protects in his silence. Its features, once sharply defined, had been worn smooth by my thumb over countless decades of anxious prayer. I had always found comfort in his quiet strength, his unwavering faithfulness, his steadfast protection of the Holy Family. In moments of doubt, in times of uncertainty, I would instinctively reach for him, my thumb finding the smooth contours of his head, his folded arms, a silent plea for intercession. But on that particular Tuesday, as I drove towards diocesan headquarters, the statue felt different. It was still there, a familiar presence, but my connection to it felt thin, like a cord stretched taut to breaking. It had become less a symbol of hope and more a relic of a faith I now questioned, a sad reminder of a comfort I no longer fully possessed. I looked at the sleeping figure, its serene expression a stark contrast to the turmoil within me, and wondered if even he, the silent protector, had grown weary of my ceaseless anxieties. My unending doubts. I had always taught my parishioners that God was present in every moment, every breath, every heartbeat. Yet, that morning, I felt profoundly alone, adrift in a universe that seemed to have forgotten my address, a universe where even my most desperate prayers felt unheard, unacknowledged, like letters sent to an address I was no longer sure of. This was the man I was that day. Not a priest with a vibrant faith ready to face any trial, but a priest on the cusp of his own quiet surrender, carrying the burden of an empty church, hollow sermons, and prayers that felt like whispers into a void. I was driving towards an ending, utterly unaware that the true beginning of my faith, a beginning marked by the impossible, the miraculous, and the undeniable presence of God, was only moments away, waiting for me on a stretch of highway under a steel-colored sky. The world outside my sedan on that stretch of Highway 12 felt like a direct mirror of the barren landscape within my soul. A gray ribbon of asphalt unfurled endlessly before me, disappearing into a horizon blurred by an oppressive, steel-colored sky that seemed to press down on the very roof of my car. There was no sun to warm the insidious chill that had settled deep in my bones, a cold that felt both physical and profoundly spiritual, creeping up from the worn floorboards of the sedan, through the seat and into my chest. There was no hint of blue or gold to suggest a benevolent presence watching from above, no break in the monotone gloom that might whisper of hope or divine comfort, just a vast monochromatic canvas, a fitting, almost mournful backdrop for a spirit that felt utterly drained of vibrant hope, bleached of its former certainties, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. I was a man driving towards an ending, or so I believed then. My destination was merely diocesan headquarters, but in my heart, I was journeying to a final, quiet surrender. I was utterly unaware in those profound moments of despair that the true beginning of my faith, a beginning marked not by gradual understanding but by the impossible, the miraculous, and the undeniable tangible presence of God, was only moments away. It lay waiting for me on this very stretch of highway, under that desolate, unforgiving sky. It's a poignancy I carry now, looking back, the deep, aching irony of believing I was facing an end, when in truth, I was on the cusp of a most astonishing rebirth. My crisis of faith, which had been a quiet, insidious thing for years, had solidified into a heavy, suffocating weight. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse, no thunderclap of doubt that might have provided a clear enemy to fight. Rather, it was a slow, relentless erosion, like water carving away at a once sturdy coastline, patiently, ceaselessly, leaving behind only crumbling cliffs and a vast, indifferent ocean where vibrant life once teemed. Piece by piece, the solid ground of my conviction had given way. First, the certainty of my own spiritual efficacy, then the immediate presence of God in prayer, then the profound mystery of the sacraments, all seemed to slip through my grasp like fine sand. The sturdy coastline had been the unwavering faith of my youth, the fervent belief that God's hand was always visible, His voice always audible if one only listened. Now, there was just the emptiness, the echo of His absence. For 40 years, I had stood at the altar, the heavy, familiar vestments a comfort that was slowly turning into a burden. I had offered the Eucharist, elevating the host and chalice, speaking the words of consecration that were meant to transform bread and wine into the very body and blood of Christ. But for months, perhaps even years, I had felt only the bread, tasted only the wine, my heart questioning the resonance of the sacred words, the miracle I was supposed to be enacting. I had absolved sins in the dim quiet of the confessional, listening to the whispered burdens of my flock, speaking words of forgiveness I prayed were true, even as I doubted their source. And I had buried the dead, offering words of eternal life and resurrection. Attempting to comfort grieving families with promises my own heart increasingly found difficult to believe. The weight of that charade, however unintentional, had become almost unbearable. Now, the words felt hollower than ever, echoes in a vast empty chasm within me. The prayers, the blessings, the comforting scriptures, they were sounds without substance, forms without spirit. My sermons, once delivered with a fervent conviction that I prayed was infectious, now felt like whispers into a void, unacknowledged, unheard. I would prepare them, poring over theological texts, searching for inspiration, but often finding only intellectual exercises, clever turns of phrase without the spark of divine truth. I imagined my parishioners, if any still truly listened to the aging priest in the pulpit, seeing through the performance, sensing the fatigue, the profound spiritual weariness that had settled upon their Father Michael like a shroud. I feared my lack of inner light was casting a long shadow over their own flickering faith. I remember my hands, veined and spotted with the marks of age, gripping the steering wheel, the worn leather smooth and cold beneath my touch. These were the same hands that had held countless hosts, raised chalices, given blessings, and offered comfort to the dying and the bereaved. They had cradled infants at baptism and anointed the foreheads of the ill with the oil of healing. But on that particular Tuesday they felt strangely inadequate, devoid of the old familiar power, that conduit to grace I had once taken for granted. They were just hands, old and tired, gripping a mundane object in a world that felt equally mundane and devoid of the sacred. I was lost, not in the geographical sense, for I knew this highway by heart, every familiar bend and rise, every exit sign. No, I was lost in a melancholic review of my life's work, a relentless mental inventory of every decision made, every path taken, every soul I thought I had guided. Had I truly guided them, or merely pointed them in a direction I no longer fully believed in myself? The questions spiraled, each one a fresh thorn in the already bleeding landscape of my spirit, twisting and digging deeper into the raw, exposed nerves of my doubt. I replayed conversations with doubting teenagers, their earnest, questioning eyes searching mine for answers I no longer felt I possessed. I revisited the grief-stricken faces of widows, clinging to my words as a lifeline, and wondered if I had given them platitudes instead of truth, empty assurances instead of genuine solace. I remembered men, their voices hoarse with shame, battling unseen demons in the confessional, their faith fragile, and mine too had become so. A wave of profound guilt washed over me, cold and clammy, at the thought of having potentially misled, however unintentionally, those who had placed their fragile trust in me. My own prayers, once the bedrock of my existence, the very breath of my spiritual life, had dwindled to rote recitations, a mechanical exercise of habit. I would kneel, close my eyes, and try with all my waning will to conjure the image of a loving, watchful God. But increasingly I would find only the vastness of my own inadequacy, the chilling silence of what felt like a truly forgotten address in the cosmic mail system. It was as if heaven had changed its number, and I, the faithful correspondent of 40 years, was left with a sheaf of undeliverable letters, each one a testament to a communication broken, a connection lost. The silence was not peaceful, it was deafening, a vacuum that sucked all spiritual oxygen from my world. The world outside my car was a muted affair, reflecting the muted landscape of my interior life. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was a low, monotonous drone, a dirge-like soundtrack to my internal lament. Leafless trees, stark and skeletal, lined the highway, their gnarled branches reaching like spectral bony fingers towards the brooding, heavily pregnant sky. Their starkness seemed to mock the bareness of my own spiritual tree, stripped of its leaves of faith, its fruits of hope. The occasional billboard, with its brightly colored advertisements for fast food or vacation getaways, seemed jarringly garish and profoundly out of place against the muted palette of my despair. A cynical reminder of a vibrant, materialistic world I felt increasingly disconnected from. I passed towns whose names I knew by heart. Harmony, redemption, grace, each name now a cruel irony to my present state of mind. There was no harmony in my heart, only discord and disillusionment. No redemption for my perceived failure, only a creeping sense of spiritual abandonment. And certainly no grace to be found in my impending retreat from the priesthood, only the bitter taste of defeat. My gaze drifted to the passenger seat, where my carefully worded letter of early retirement lay, stark white against the dark, practical fabric of the seat. It was more than a letter. It was a physical manifestation of my despair, an admission of defeat, a confession of my profound spiritual exhaustion. I had composed it with painstaking effort, choosing each word to convey a respectful yet firm concession to what I felt was the inevitable. It represented the final crushing weight of giving up. I had envisioned the quiet life that would follow. A small apartment, perhaps with a window overlooking a modest garden, a library filled with books I could read purely for pleasure, without the burden of finding sermon illustrations or theological insights. It was an image of peace, yes, a longed-for respite from the spiritual battlefield, but also of profound solitude. A concession that the battle had been fought, and I, Father Michael O'Connell, had finally undeniably surrendered. The thought brought a strange mixture of relief and profound sorrow. And then, my eyes, which had been tracking the monotonous gray ahead, flicked, almost idly at first, to the rearview mirror. It was just a speck, a distant shimmering distortion in the glass, a tiny pinprick in the dull canvas behind me. A large vehicle, undoubtedly. On this stretch of highway, trucks were common, veritable leviathans of commerce rumbling along their routes. A constant mundane presence. I paid it little mind, my thoughts still consumed by the ghosts of my past 40 years, caught in the suffocating web of my internal lament. But the speck grew and grew rapidly. My pastoral gentleness, my contemplative mood, the very fabric of my internal state, began to fray at the edges, replaced by a sudden sharp prickle of unease that crawled up my spine. It wasn't just big, it was getting closer with an unnerving, almost predatory velocity. My eyes narrowed, focusing intently on the approaching threat, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. It was an 18-wheel rig, its chrome glinting dully even beneath the leaden sky, reflecting back only a smear of gray. Its massive grille, a looming, intimidating maw of steel, grew larger and larger in my mirror, consuming more and more of the distorted reflection. It was gaining on me far too quickly for a vehicle of its size, a relentless, unstoppable predator closing in on smaller, fragile prey. The sheer bulk of it seemed to absorb all light, all sound, all other considerations. The deep, guttural roar of its engine, which at first had been a distant thrum, began to penetrate the insulation of my sedan, a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my seat, rattling the very bones in my body. My internal monologue, the endless loop of doubt and regret, was abruptly, violently silenced, replaced by a rising tide of primal alarm. Every instinct screamed. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The suddenness of it was almost a shock, a brutal awakening from my spiritual stupor. I instinctively checked my speedometer. I was traveling at the posted limit, perhaps even a mile or two under, adhering to the cautious habits of a man whose primary rush in life had long since faded. There was no rational reason for this enormous truck to be bearing down on me with such terrifying speed, not unless something catastrophic had gone awry. Then I saw it. A thin puff of smoke, dark and acrid, blossomed from beneath the truck's cab, a sickening bloom against the gray asphalt. Then another, thicker, from its tires, mingling with a faint metallic scent that prickled my nose. The driver was frantically trying to brake. The air filled with a screeching, tearing sound, a violent symphony of tortured metal against asphalt that clawed at my ears, raw and terrifying, a sound of absolute, desperate futility. It was the sound of a machine fighting against its own immense momentum, a losing battle against the laws of physics. My heart began to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs, each beat a sudden painful lurch. My breath hitched in my throat, caught somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my old, weary hands now capable of an unexpected, almost desperate strength, born of sheer, unadulterated terror. I could feel the violent shudder of the road, the air around my small car beginning to warp and vibrate with the immense energy of the approaching catastrophe as the massive truck behind me began its slow, horrifying dance of death. It was a physical distortion, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched and torn. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, my eyes wide and fixed, pupils dilated with fear. The cab of the truck was beginning to fishtail, swaying violently from side to side like a wounded beast, its massive weight uncontrollable, a terrible pendulum counting down my final seconds. It veered across its lane, then back, then started to pivot with a dreadful, unstoppable grace that belied the horror of its intent. Through the distorted glass, for a horrifying instant that burned itself into my memory, I saw the driver's face. It was a mask of sheer, white-knuckled terror, his eyes wide and glazed with abject horror, locked onto my small, fragile car. He was fighting, I knew, fighting with every ounce of his being for both our lives, but his struggle was a losing one, etched in the helpless contortion of his features. His face, frozen in that moment of ultimate powerlessness, perfectly mirrored the consuming fear that was now devouring me. It was the face of a man who knew he was about to cause an unspeakable tragedy, utterly unable to prevent it, a victim of circumstance himself. The truck, its brakes howling in protest, no longer merely fishtailed. It began its slow, inevitable, horrifying jackknife. The trailer, a towering wall of corrugated steel, began to arc outward, swinging with a terrifying, crushing momentum across 3 lanes of traffic. It was moving directly, inexorably toward my small, vulnerable car, now trapped against the guardrail on the right, a helpless, insignificant obstacle in the path of a juggernaut. There was nowhere to go. To my left, the other lanes were filling with cars, their drivers just beginning to register the unfolding catastrophe, their brake lights flaring in a sudden, desperate crimson wave that washed over the highway. To my right, the unforgiving, unyielding steel of the guardrail, an impenetrable barrier. The world seemed to slow down, each agonizing second stretching into an eternity, every pulse of my frantic heart a lifetime. The roar of the truck's engine, the desperate scream of its tires, the metallic groans of its chassis, the shrieking wind of its passage, all converged into a single deafening crescendo, a violent symphony of destruction. My eyes, locked onto the monstrous trailer that was about to consume me, registered every terrifying detail with horrifying clarity. The rust spots on the corrugated steel, the faded lettering of the trucking company, the mud splatters on the immense tires, each one a stark, final image. It was coming. There was no escape. This was it. The journey, the doubt, the weariness, the unfiled letter of resignation. All of it was about to be extinguished in a catastrophic symphony of twisted metal and shattered glass. My life, such as it was, a life defined by spiritual struggle and waning faith, was moments from its violent, unavoidable conclusion. The metallic shriek and groan of the semi, the desperate scream of its tires, the sheer, bone-rattling force of its approach, all of it culminated in a single, deafening crescendo that assaulted every fiber of my being. My vision, hyper-focused, took in the rust spots on the corrugated steel, the faded lettering of the trucking company, the mud splatters on the immense tires, each detail searing itself into my memory as if my brain were trying to capture a final, impossibly sharp photograph of the instrument of my demise. This was it. The journey, the doubt, the weariness, the unfiled letter of resignation, all of it was about to be extinguished in a catastrophic symphony of twisted metal and shattered glass. My life, such as it was, a life defined by spiritual struggle and waning faith, was moments from its violent, unavoidable conclusion, and yet, in that final, suspended sliver of time, a moment that stretched and distended like taffy pulled by an unseen hand, paradoxically both infinite and vanishingly brief, a profound stillness descended upon the core of my being. The world outside roared its death knell, but within me, the frantic clamor of fear, the racing of my heart, the surge of adrenaline, all began to recede, leaving behind an eerie, almost peaceful clarity. It was the clarity of acceptance, the chilling calm of a soul stripped bare, having shed all pretense, all hope, all expectation. I was not ready to die, not in any conventional sense, but there was no fighting it, no escaping it. The sheer, overwhelming power bearing down on me rendered all resistance utterly moot. My mind, an old, weary engine, seemed to shift into a hyper-efficient mode, processing the impossibility of the situation with a detached, almost academic precision. I registered the impending impact not with a scream, but with a silent nod, a grim acknowledgement of the universe's indifferent mechanics. The physics of it were undeniable. The weight, the speed, the trajectory. There would be no survivors. I was already a ghost, waiting for the material world to catch up. What surprised me, what truly astonished me in that profound moment of existential reckoning, was the utter emptiness where my prepared prayers should have been. For 40 years, I had preached the efficacy of the rosary, the solace of the act of contrition, the power of intercession. I had taught my flock how to die well, how to face their final moments with grace and faith, their lips moving with ancient holy words. But now, in the face of my own end, the elegant theological prayers I had learned in the seminary, the rhythmic cadence of the liturgy, the comforting litanies I had murmured over countless dying beds, they all vanished. They evaporated like mist in a sudden, brutal heat, leaving behind no trace. My mind was not a sanctuary of sacred verses. It was a blank slate, scrubbed clean by the abrasive force of terror and ultimate surrender. There was no time for contemplation, no space for the careful crafting of a plea. There was no Hail Mary, no Our Father, no Gloria. My spiritual toolbox, once so full of the implements of salvation, was suddenly, devastatingly empty. It was as if my faith, already fragile and worn thin by years of doubt, had finally snapped, rendering me spiritually naked and vulnerable. How ironic, I thought with a grim interior chuckle that barely registered. A priest, facing death, without a single prayer on his lips. My life's work, a testament to the power of prayer, had seemingly failed its most important test, my own. For years I had wrestled with the encroaching silence I perceived from God. The world grew louder, more demanding, while the divine whisper I once knew seemed to fade into an indistinct hum. Then nothing at all. My sermons, once delivered with robust conviction, had become exercises in intellectual performance, their words echoing in a church that grew emptier with each passing year. My parishioners, too, seemed increasingly lost in the currents of a secular age, their questions sharp, their doubts mirroring my own. I had tried to give them answers, to shore up their slipping faith, even as my own foundations crumbled beneath my feet. The letter of early retirement, nestled on the passenger seat beside me, was not merely a document of resignation, it was a physical manifestation of my spiritual defeat, a surrender to the overwhelming suspicion that perhaps, after all, I had been speaking to an empty sky. What good was a shepherd who no longer heard the voice of the master, who could no longer discern the path? My impending death, in a twisted, cynical way, felt like a perverse mercy, a final, definitive answer to a lifelong question I had not dared to voice aloud. Was anyone truly there? And yet, deeper than thought, more fundamental than theology, something primal stirred. It was not a theological awakening, it was an instinct, raw and unbidden, a reflex born not of spiritual erudition, but of something far more ancient, more deeply ingrained in the human spirit than any learned doctrine. My hand, acting on its own volition, as if guided by an invisible, forgotten current of my soul, shot out. It moved not with conscious intent, but with the desperate, unthinking urgency of a drowning man reaching for any scrap of driftwood. My fingers, trembling, not from fear now, but from this strange, compelling urgency, found purchase. They closed around the familiar smooth contours of the small hand-carved statue of a sleeping Saint Joseph on my dashboard. Its features, worn smooth by decades of my thumb tracing its serene lines during countless anxious prayers, offered a tactile anchor in the swirling chaos. It was a simple piece of olive wood, a gift from my mother on the day of my ordination. She had pressed it into my hand with a quiet smile, her eyes full of a faith that, even then, I secretly envied for its unwavering certainty. "He was a carpenter, Michael," she had said, "a humble man, but the protector of the Holy Family. When you feel lost or doubt your path, remember Joseph. He understood quiet service, and he always found a way." I remembered her words now, not as a coherent thought, but as a faint echo, a whisper from a distant, more innocent time. The cool, dense wood in my palm was solid, impossibly real, a small bastion of tangible reality against the encroaching unreality of my demise. It was not a relic of power, not a sacred artifact imbued with magical properties, but a symbol of simple, enduring faith, a symbol of my mother, a symbol perhaps of a part of myself I had long since suppressed or forgotten in the labyrinthine corridors of academic theology and pastoral duties. It was a fragment of my childhood, a whisper of a time when faith had been as natural as breathing, uncomplicated by the complexities of adult doubt or theological hair-splitting. It was a link to a past self, a self who believed without question, who trusted implicitly. As my fingers tightened around the statue, something shifted within me. The blankness, the emptiness, began to fill, not with eloquence, but with a profound, aching need. My heart, which moments before had felt like a hollow drum, now cried out. It was not a prayer in the traditional sense, not a formal invocation carefully structured with proper address and petition. No, this was something far more visceral, far more elemental. It was a guttural plea, a soundless scream that ripped through the very fabric of my being, tearing away layers of priestly decorum, intellectual doubt, and spiritual fatigue. It was the cry of a child, lost and terrified, reaching out for any hand in the dark. It was the purest expression of helplessness, a stark admission that all my learning, all my ecclesiastical training, all my carefully constructed theological frameworks were utterly useless in this moment. All that remained was the raw, unadulterated yearning for succor. My own voice, raw and unfamiliar in its naked terror, filled the small, suffocating space of the car. It was not the measured, comforting voice of Father O'Connell delivering a homily. It was the voice of Michael, the boy who had once knelt beside his mother's bed, whispering simple, trusting prayers before sleep. It was a sound stripped of all artifice, all pretense, all the polished veneer of 40 years in the priesthood. It was the sound of a man utterly broken, reduced to his most fundamental essence, a creature desperately clinging to life, and to the faint, almost forgotten hope of something beyond himself. "Joseph!" I cried out, the name tearing from my throat, sharp and desperate, a singular sound against the cacophony of the approaching truck. "Protector of the Holy Family, protect me now!" The words were not chosen. They erupted. They were not thought. They were felt. They were not a theological statement. They were a primal scream, an instinctual lunge toward the only name that came to mind, the only figure that offered a flicker of humble, tangible hope in the face of absolute annihilation. Why Joseph? Perhaps it was the connection to my mother, to that simple, unassuming faith. Perhaps it was his very humanity, his role as a foster father, a provider, a quiet presence, not the grandeur of God the Father, or the sacrificial love of Christ, or the queenly intercession of Mary, but Joseph, the humble carpenter, the silent guardian, the man who simply did. He was approachable, relatable in a way that the more exalted figures of the Holy Trinity sometimes felt distant from my weary, doubting soul. He was the saint of quiet work, of practical solutions, of everyday protection. And in this moment of ultimate, inescapable peril, a practical solution, a humble protector was all I could cling to. It was a prayer born not of intellectual assent, or even profound spiritual conviction, but of sheer, unadulterated, terror-stricken desperation. It was a gamble, a last, desperate throw of the dice into the void, a final, despairing cry into what I had long suspected was an indifferent, silent universe. And then, just as the words left my lips, echoing faintly in the confined space, a new sensation, not of impact, not yet, but a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a momentary pause in the relentless march of destruction. It was like the brief, pregnant silence between a lightning flash and the thunderclap, a fraction of a second where the world held its breath. My eyes, still wide and fixed on the immense, grimy side of the semi, registered no change, yet my entire being vibrated with the inexplicable awareness that something, however minute, however impossible, had just occurred. My grip on the little wooden statue tightened further, my knuckles white. It was cold in my hand, yet it felt as if it pulsed with a faint internal warmth, a warmth that seemed to spread from my palm, up my arm, and into my chest, a sudden surprising counterpoint to the icy grip of fear that had held me captive. Was it merely the adrenaline playing tricks, the mind's desperate attempt to find solace in the face of the inevitable? Or was it something else? My analytical mind, the mind of a priest trained in philosophy and apologetics, tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away. A figment of my imagination, a last-ditch coping mechanism. But the raw animal part of me, the part that had screamed out St. Joseph's name, refused to be silenced. It felt as though a connection, thin as a spider's silk, but undeniably present, had been made. I had flung my last tattered shred of belief into the abyss, and for a fleeting moment, I sensed a faint tremor of response. The universe, which had seemed so deaf, so indifferent, had perhaps, for a single impossible breath, inclined its ear. My words had been unadorned, devoid of theological profundity, born of the stark reality of my impending death. Yet, in that naked plea, I had finally found a truth that had eluded me for years. The truth that sometimes, when all else fails, all we can do is cry out a name, and hope, against all logic and reason, that someone, somewhere, is listening. The world held its breath. And so did I, waiting for the end that now felt impossibly both certain and strangely profoundly, just a hair's breadth away. The world, in that suspended breath after my desperate plea, did not immediately erupt into the cacophony of a collision. Instead, it sharpened, paradoxically slowing and intensifying all at once, like a film reel suddenly caught in slow motion, yet every single frame burned with a heightened, excruciating clarity. The faint tremor of response I had felt, the fleeting suggestion that my raw, primal cry had found a receiver somewhere beyond the steel-colored sky, lingered within me. It was like the last resonant note of a great bronze bell in a vast empty hall, vibrating in the silence, a fragile promise against an undeniable terror. For a split second, I wondered if this was the answer to my long-silenced doubts, a divine whisper breaking through the static of my weary soul, or merely the desperate flicker of a mind clinging to hope in its final moments. My car, my little sedan, that familiar vessel of quiet contemplation and pastoral visits, suddenly felt not like a humble conveyance, but a fragile shell in a world made suddenly of diamond-hard glass, about to shatter into a million deadly shards. I could feel the worn fabric of the driver's seat beneath me, the smooth plastic of the steering wheel warm under my palms, the faint scent of old leather, and the lingering trace of a forgotten hymn book from the glove compartment. These mundane details, usually unnoticed, now presented themselves with a heartbreaking precision, anchoring me to a life that was about to be violently ripped away. The very air around me seemed to thicken, to compress, holding its breath just as I held mine, a heavy leaden blanket pressing against my chest, making each gasp for air a conscious, painful effort. The light through the windshield, which moments before had promised an indifferent afternoon, now seemed warped, bending around the monstrous shape approaching, casting strange, distorted shadows within my small cabin. I remember my gaze, still fixed with a dreadful fascination on the approaching behemoth in my rearview mirror, the curved glass distorting its already terrifying bulk, making it appear even more grotesque, more unstoppable. Then, in a frantic, almost involuntary flick, my eyes swung back to the windshield, as if I could outrun destiny with my eyes alone, searching for an escape that simply did not exist. The truck, an 18-wheeler that had become a monstrous, uncontrolled projectile, filled the entire frame of my vision, blotting out the world beyond. It was no longer a vehicle but a force of nature, an avalanche of steel and rubber, its massive grimy tires churning the asphalt, its chrome grille a gaping maw. It was driven not by a human hand, but by a terror as palpable as my own, a runaway beast hurtling towards its terrible, inevitable purpose. I could just make out the distorted, panicked face of the driver through his windshield, a mask of sheer horror that mirrored my own. Time, that relentless river which usually flowed with such predictable monotony through the days of my priestly life, seemed to eddy and swirl, stretching out the seconds into an eternity. In that agonizing suspension, my mind, stripped of its usual theological complexities, became a whirlwind of raw images and fleeting sensations. I saw the grim, unyielding curve of the highway ahead, the blur of indifferent trees on the verge, the distant, impassive horizon that offered no solace, no sign of divine intervention. There was no escape, no sudden turn onto a hidden side road, no miraculous opening in the unforgiving steel of the guardrail. Just the straight, undeniable path of destruction, a corridor narrowing to an inescapable point. My internal landscape, usually a complex tapestry woven with threads of theological musings, pastoral anxieties, and the quiet comfort of daily prayers, became stark, simplified, reduced to its bare, terrifying essence. All those years of seminary, the endless hours poring over ancient texts, the elegant formulations of prayer, all the comforting rituals and dogmas of the church, they dissolved, vanished. In their place remained only a single, raw, primitive awareness. This is how it ends. This was the culmination of my life, not in a peaceful bed, surrounded by loved ones, but here, on a desolate stretch of highway, crushed by an indifferent machine. The irony of my crisis of faith, the very doubt that had led me to write my letter of resignation, now pressed in on me with an almost unbearable weight. Was this the answer to my question then? An abrupt, violent end, devoid of grace or meaning? And yet, beneath the terror, beneath the crushing weight of certainty, there was the faintest, most persistent echo of that name I had cried out. Joseph. Had it been a prayer, a formal invocation born of habit, or merely a primal reflex, a desperate sound flung into the void, hoping to catch on something, anything in the vast, uncaring universe? The irony was not lost on me, even in that moment of extremity, that after decades of formal supplication, of reciting the ancient liturgies and beautifully crafted prayers of the church, my truest, most honest prayer had been a primal shriek, a single unadorned name ripped from the deepest part of my being. It was the prayer of a terrified child crying for its father, stripped bare of all pretense, all theology, all intellectual scaffolding. It was a plea from a soul laid utterly bare, a pure, unadulterated cry for rescue. Across the asphalt divide, high above me in the towering cab of the semi, a man named Frank was experiencing his own, equally profound and utterly horrifying eternity. His hands, white-knuckled and trembling with the strength born of pure panic, were locked onto the steering wheel, every muscle in his arms screaming in futile effort. Sweat beaded on his brow, trickling into his eyes and mingling with the hot, stinging tears that pricked at them. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, irregular drumbeat signaling not just the end of a journey, but the end of everything. The stench of burning rubber, the high-pitched shriek of tortured metal, the guttural roar of his engine, all assaulted his senses, amplifying the terror. Through his elevated windshield, the road ahead seemed to disappear beneath the rapidly expanding hood of his rig, a relentless, unstoppable force of destruction. Frank had been a truck driver for 30 years, traversing the arteries of this vast continent, seeing every kind of road, every kind of weather, from the desolate stretches of desert heat to the treacherous grip of mountain passes in winter, from the indifferent sprawl of cities to the lonely, starlit nights. He had prided himself on his skill, his command of the massive machine, his ability to navigate any challenge the road threw at him. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment, for the betrayal of his own rig, for the stark, horrifying reality of becoming an unwilling instrument of death. The memory of his wife, of his grandchildren flashed through his mind, quickly replaced by the cold, hard certainty of the disaster unfolding. The telltale shudder, the violent lurch of the cab as his brakes had failed moments before, had been the harbinger of disaster, a sickening, gut-wrenching sensation that instantly turned his life upside down. He'd pumped them, cursed them, stomped on them with a desperate fury that was both useless and utterly human, a primal scream of frustration and terror. The rig, now freed from the tyranny of friction, had gained speed with a terrifying eagerness, a runaway beast hurtling towards its terrible purpose, ignoring his pleas, deaf to his curses. Frank had seen my small car ahead, a dark, unassuming shape, far too fragile, and watched in horror as his own 18-wheeler transformed into a weapon, arcing across the lanes, jackknifing with a slow, ponderous inevitability. He remembered shouting, "No! Oh God, no, please, no!" His voice, raspy and choked with terror, was lost in the growing shriek of tortured metal and rubber, a sound that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the air itself. He saw my head, a small dark silhouette within my car's window, and for a fleeting, excruciating second, he met my gaze in his rearview mirror. In my eyes, he saw a stark terror mirrored in his own, and then, to his utter bewilderment, a strange, almost serene acceptance, just before my hand reached out to grasp something small on my dashboard. He felt the sickening lurch of the trailer as it swung wide, its massive side a looming wall of corrugated steel, adorned with years of road grime and the faded outline of a forgotten company logo aimed with a dreadful precision at my driver's side door. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that he was about to become an instrument of death, a bringer of unimaginable sorrow. The impact, when it came, would be total. There would be nothing left. He braced himself, a silent plea for forgiveness escaping his lips, a desperate prayer not for himself, but for the innocent life he was about to extinguish, knowing with a despair that was almost physical, that it was far too late. Behind us, a tableau of unfolding catastrophe had frozen other lives in place. Drivers, commuters, families on their way to weekend adventures, all became unwitting witnesses to a disaster that, in its terrible clarity, defied the imagination, snatching them from the mundane and plunging them into a shared nightmare. The ordinary hum of the highway, the gentle flow of traffic, was instantly shattered, replaced by the collective gasp of horror. Sarah, a young mother driving her 2 small children to grandmother's house, had been humming along to a children's song, her mind on grocery lists and playground dates, the scent of Cheerios and apple juice filling her minivan. Then, in her rearview mirror, the enormous out-of-control truck had blossomed, filling her entire vision with its menace, a terrifying, grotesque flower of steel and destruction. She saw the little black sedan, so impossibly small, so utterly vulnerable, caught between the runaway rig and the unyielding guardrail. Her foot, without conscious thought, slammed the brake pedal, the sudden jolt sending a doll flying from the dashboard. Her hands flew instinctively to cover her children's eyes in the back seat, shielding them from the horror about to unfold. A desperate, futile maternal gesture. She felt a scream claw its way up her throat, not for herself, but for the strangers in those 2 vehicles, for the sheer, brutal unfairness of it all, for the sudden, senseless loss of life. "Oh my God, no!" she choked, tears blurring her vision, her body rigid with a helplessness that was agonizing. Her children's small voices, usually so bright, now hushed in confused silence behind her. In the car beside her, an elderly couple, George and Martha, who had seen their share of life's tragedies, watched with a quiet, resigned dread that was perhaps more terrifying than outright panic. George, his hand still on the wheel but his foot hovering over the brake, felt a cold knot form in his stomach, tightening with each passing second. He'd seen accident scenes before, had even been the first responder to a few in his younger years. But this was different. This wasn't a fender bender or a minor tangle of crumpled sheet metal. This was the raw, unvarnished face of instant oblivion, a complete and total erasure. The geometry of it was chillingly clear in his experienced mind. The impossible speed, the precise angle of the jackknife, the sheer crushing mass of the truck against the fragile sedan. Martha, her hand flying to her mouth, began to murmur prayers, rosary beads, smooth and worn by countless petitions, clutched tight in her other hand. She whispered the Hail Mary, the Our Father, the Gloria, her voice a barely audible hum against the rising crescendo of the disaster. They both knew, with the somber wisdom of their years, that what was coming would leave no survivors. It was not just an accident, it was an execution, a predetermined fate playing out before their eyes. Several cars had already begun to pull over, their drivers either paralyzed by shock or instinctively seeking distance from the inevitable blast of metal and glass. They emerged from their vehicles, some with phones already raised in trembling hands, others simply standing, mouths agape, as if the very air had been sucked out of their lungs. Their faces, uniformly pale, reflected a shared understanding. This was a scene beyond recovery, a tragedy that would forever mark this stretch of highway. A few women gasped, men muttered in disbelief, but mostly there was a stunned collective silence, punctuated only by the growing roar of the truck. They braced for the sound, the eruption, the gruesome tableau that would forever be etched into their memories, an indelible scar on the canvas of their lives. It was a disaster unfolding in a horrifying, protracted slow motion, each fractional second weighted with the absolute certainty of doom. The shared, unspoken thought rippling through the small crowd of involuntary witnesses was one of profound despair, a silent elegy for lives already lost. Later, much later, when the dust had settled and the initial shock had begun to recede, when the sirens had faded and the curious had dispersed, the official accident reconstruction report would be meticulously compiled. Engineers, trained to dissect the cold, hard facts of physics and trajectory, would pore over every detail. They would measure skid marks, calculate impact forces, analyze the deformation of metal, and draw vectors of momentum with chilling precision. And they would come to a unanimous, immutable conclusion, expressed in their dispassionate, scientific language, based on the speeds involved, the immense weight differential, and the precise angle of the jackknife trailer. The impact on my small sedan should have been unequivocally, undeniably, unsurvivable. The mathematical models, the immutable laws of kinetic energy, they all pointed to one outcome: obliteration. The seasoned veterans of highway tragedies, the state troopers who had seen countless mangled vehicles, their mangled forms forever imprinted on their minds, and delivered devastating news to grieving families with heavy hearts. The paramedics who had worked tirelessly on the bloody scenes of carnage, their hands stained, their souls weary. The tow truck drivers who had hooked up twisted heaps of steel that bore no resemblance to cars, their faces grimly impassive. All of them would later confess in hushed tones, their voices tinged with a bewildered awe, their eyes reflecting a profound confusion, that they had never, in their long, difficult careers, seen anything like what transpired that day. They would speak of it not as an accident, but as an anomaly, a disruption of known laws, a scene that made no logical sense in a world governed by cause and effect, by gravity and mass. For now, though, none of that detached analysis existed, only the terrifying, crystal-clear present. The truck continued its inexorable swing. My car, so small, so fragile, was now directly in its path. The roar of the engine, the shriek of struggling tires, the metallic groans and creaks of the trailer, all converged into a single, overwhelming crescendo, a terrifying symphony of destruction. I felt the vibration through the floor of the car, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to emanate not just from the powerful engine of the truck, but from the very core of the earth itself, shaking my bones, rattling my teeth, my breath caught in my throat. Held captive by a fear that had transcended mere panic. My hand, still gripping the small, smooth statue of St. Joseph, felt cold and distant, a faint connection to a hope I was struggling to hold on to. I saw the glint of the truck's chrome, reflecting the harsh, indifferent light, the rust-colored grime on its massive tires spinning towards me, the sheer, implacable indifference of its momentum, an unstoppable force. It was no longer a question of if the impact would occur, but precisely when. And then, in that final, suspended fraction of a second, the impossible scene became complete. A silent film reel paused just before the catastrophic frame, every detail frozen in terrifying clarity. The world waited. And so did I, a priest stripped bare of everything but a name whispered in fear and a trembling hope, for the end to come. The world waited. And so did I, a priest stripped bare of everything but a name whispered in fear and a trembling hope, for the end to come. And then, in that suspended fraction of a second, the end did not come as expected. It came instead as a beginning, veiled in the impossible. There was no explosion, no shattering glass, no rending steel, no searing pain that the mind, in its final moments, anticipates with a dreadful clarity. The ear-splitting shriek of the truck's tires, which had been the soundtrack to my terror, abruptly ceased, swallowed not by the cacophony of a crash, but by a sound so utterly out of place that it stitched itself into the fabric of my memory with needle-sharp precision. It was a deep, resonant, impossibly solid thump, Not sharp or violent, but full-bodied, like an ancient oak tree, felled by a master's axe, settling onto soft earth in a silent forest. A sound that spoke of strength, of rootedness, of a profound and organic weight. The violent shudder I had braced for, the whiplash, the impact that would crush bone and metal alike. It never materialized. Instead, a gentle tremor ran through the car. A vibration akin to the deep hum of a distant church bell, or the settling of foundations after a quiet construction. It was subtle, almost caressing, as if the very atoms of my vehicle had been momentarily rearranged by a benevolent, invisible hand, rather than assaulted by tons of speeding steel. And then came the scent. It was not the acrid tang of burnt rubber, or the metallic reek of ruptured fuel lines, or the sterile, faint aroma of my car's interior. No, this was something ancient, something alive, something utterly misplaced on a modern highway. The air, which had been thin with my terror, suddenly thickened, growing rich and redolent with the honest, earthy perfume of a carpenter's workshop. It was the sharp, clean aroma of freshly cut cedar, mingled with the warmer, resinous notes of olive wood, a scent I knew intimately from the small crucifixes and rosaries my mother had cherished, crafted from wood sourced from the Holy Land. And underneath it all, a faint, sweet, almost almond-like dustiness, the unmistakable essence of fine sawdust, lingering as if 1,000 years of patient labor had just concluded around me. For a single, fleeting second, a blink that stretched into an eternity, my vision through the windshield was not filled with the brutal chrome grille of the semi-truck. In its place, filling my entire field of view, was a wall. Not a wall of concrete or brick or stone, but a seamless tapestry of wood. Planks of deep, rich, ancient timber, fitted together with an artistry that defied the crude mechanics of nails and screws. Each grain was visible, a swirling testament to time and growth, to the patient shaping of nature and hand. There were no seams, no gaps, only the impeccable, tight-fitting joints of a master craftsman, imbued with a quiet power that hummed just beneath the surface. It was a wall of warmth, of strength, of immovable grace, illuminated by an interior golden light that seemed to pulse from within the wood itself. It felt solid, immensely, impossibly solid, a bulwark against the forces of oblivion. And in that fleeting moment, I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and reason, that it was there for me. It was a shield, forged of faith and silence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it dissolved, not shattered, not broken, but simply unmade, fading like mist before the sun, retreating not into fragments, but into an almost ethereal absence. And in its place, the massive, monstrous front of the semi-truck hung suspended, not touching, not even grazing, but arrested. It was there, immense and terrifying, but utterly still, its formidable grille inches, mere inches, from my dashboard. Its momentum, which had been so implacable, so absolute, was gone. It had simply stopped. My hands, still gripping the small, smooth statue of St. Joseph, were trembling now, but not from fear. My breath, which I hadn't realized I'd been holding, escaped in a ragged gasp. The profound silence that followed was broken only by the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine and the frantic thrumming of my own heart against my ribs. I stared, transfixed, at the truck's grille. No damage, not a scratch. It seemed impossible. I slowly turned my head, my neck stiff, and looked at the driver of the truck. His face, which had been contorted in an image of pure, white-knuckled terror, was now frozen in an expression of profound, uncomprehending bewilderment. His mouth was open slightly, his eyes wide, fixed on my car as if it were a phantom. He too must have seen something, felt something, in that impossible moment. The rich, aromatic scent of wood still lingered, a warm, comforting cloud inside my car, slowly beginning to dissipate, but leaving its ethereal memory behind. I opened my hand, looking down at the small, worn wooden statue of St. Joseph. Its features, smoothed by decades of prayer, seemed to hold a new, quiet serenity. It felt warm. Impossibly warm against my palm, as if it had just absorbed the very essence of that miraculous wooden wall. My mind, trained in theological discourse, struggled to find a framework for what had just transpired. Physics demanded that I should be a mangled corpse, my car a compressed coffin. Logic insisted that a massive truck, its brakes failed, could not simply cease its forward momentum inches from its target, without impact, without explanation. Yet here I was, intact, unscathed, and the scent of olive wood clung to my clothes, to the upholstery, a testament more real than any broken glass could have been. I took a shaky breath, trying to slow the furious pounding in my chest. This wasn't a near miss. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some freak mechanical anomaly. This was an intervention, a tangible, undeniable, utterly divine intervention. The wall of wood, the specific, impossible scent, the gentle tremor in place of violence, the truck's impossible halt, Each detail was a brushstroke in a portrait of the miraculous. And the name I had cried out, the desperate, guttural plea that had escaped my lips in that final terrifying instant, echoed in my mind. Joseph, protector of the Holy Family, protect me now. Could it be? Could the silent, humble carpenter, the guardian of the Holy Family, have heard my cry? Could he, in his quiet power, have literally built a wall of wood, of the very material he knew best, to shield a doubting, weary priest from the jaws of certain death? The idea was preposterous, fantastical, breathtakingly audacious. And yet, it was the only explanation that held any truth, that resonated with the profound, awe-filled silence that had descended upon the highway. I looked around. Other cars, which had pulled over in anticipation of a catastrophe, were now slowly beginning to move, their drivers craning their necks, their faces a mixture of confusion and relief. They had witnessed a disaster averted, but they could not have understood how. They had not smelled the wood, had not seen the impossible wall, had not heard the deep thump that had redefined reality. I was alive, not by chance, not by engineering, but by something else entirely, something ancient, something holy, something that defied the very laws of the world I thought I knew. My crisis of faith, which had been a slow, suffocating surrender, had just been ripped open by a torrent of undeniable wonder. My heart, so recently heavy with defeat, now swelled with a terrifying, exhilarating awe. I had been brought to the very precipice of death, only to be shown in the most impossible and intimate way that I was not alone. Heaven was not just listening, it was actively, physically, powerfully present. And it smelled of a carpenter's workshop. The aroma of wood, still faintly clinging to my suit, mingled now with the sharp tang of burnt rubber and spilled fuel. The world, which had moments ago been a canvas of impossible wonder, slowly began to reassert its grittier reality around me. Paramedics were still buzzing, their voices a distant hum, checking me over with bewildered expressions, as if I were a ghost materializing from thin air. But it was the state trooper who finally anchored me back to the bizarre normalcy of the aftermath. His presence a stark contrast to the ethereal moment I had just experienced, his uniform a crisp, authoritative blue amidst the chaos. He was a young man, earnest and broad-shouldered, his face smudged with dust but his eyes clear and direct. He had already introduced himself as Trooper Davies, and now, as he approached, his gaze was fixed not on my face, but on my chest, almost as if he expected to find something there. A sign, perhaps, of my miraculous survival. He held a small, dark object, meticulously placed within a clear plastic evidence bag. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low murmur, tinged with an almost childlike wonder that belied his professional demeanor, a hint of something deeper stirring beneath his trained objectivity. "Father Michael," he began, his brow furrowed in a way that spoke volumes of his profound confusion. "I have to ask you again, sir. Are you by any chance a carpenter?" The question, which had seemed so utterly absurd in the initial disorienting fog of shock following the impact, now resonated with an entirely new, profound meaning. The faint, sweet scent of sawdust, no longer a mere whisper in my memory but a tangible presence in the air around us, seemed to bloom, a silent, fragrant affirmation. I looked at him, then at the twisted metal of what had been my beloved sedan, now a grotesque accordion of steel, crumpled to half its original length. My gaze then drifted to the colossal semi, its front grille contorted into a snarl of steel and rubber, an engine still groaning faintly in protest. How could I explain what I had seen? How could I articulate the impossible wall of ancient wood that had stood for a single, breathtaking second between certain death and improbable survival? The words felt inadequate, almost blasphemous in their attempt to define the indefinable. Trooper Davies must have seen the dawning comprehension, or perhaps the dawning terror and awe in my eyes. For he continued, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper, as if sharing a secret. "We've been searching the scene, Father. For debris, for anything that could explain, well, this." He gestured vaguely at the mangled wreckage that defied logic, then directly at me, standing miraculously unscathed, without even a smudge of dirt on my clerical collar. "There's no tree here, no fence post, no wooden barrier of any kind for miles, just asphalt, steel, and a whole lot of very angry guardrail. But look at this." He carefully held up the evidence bag, angling it so the afternoon light caught the object within. Inside, nestled against the clear plastic, was a piece of wood. It was small, perhaps 2 inches long, but even through the transparent barrier, I could discern its texture, the dark, rich grain of it. It looked old, incredibly old, weathered by time yet somehow imbued with an enduring vitality, a warmth that seemed to radiate even through the plastic. But it wasn't just any splinter. This piece was clearly cut, not merely broken. And at one end it met another, slightly larger piece at a perfect, impossible right angle. It was a joint meticulously crafted, clean and precise, as if fashioned by a master's hand. There were no visible nails, no telltale traces of modern glue, just wood interlocking with wood in a bond of silent strength. He pulled out another, slightly larger splinter from a separate compartment in the bag, this one not joined but clearly from the same source, its surface smooth as if planed by a craftsman's loving touch. "And this," he continued, his voice hushed, the professional detachment slipping further away. "We found dozens of these, Father. Not scattered haphazardly, mind you, but embedded deep within the mangled steel grille of the truck, particularly concentrated in the area where it should have collided with your car. It's not just splintered wood, it's structural. Like fragments of a larger frame, a powerful scaffold perhaps." I leaned closer, my gaze fixed intently on the splinter, and a shiver, not of cold but of profound recognition and awe, ran through me, starting from my very core and spreading outward. This was not the pale, processed lumber of modern construction sites. This was darker, denser, imbued with a deep, earthy wisdom, a venerable age that spoke of patient craftsmanship. I could almost feel the phantom weight of ancient tools shaping it, hear the whisper of wood shavings falling to a dusty floor. "We've got a forensics team on the way," Trooper Davies added, pulling himself back slightly. "But even without them, I can tell you this isn't local. No trees like this in this region, not for hundreds of miles, possibly further. And the way it's joined, it's a mortise and tenon, isn't it? My granddad was a carpenter, dabbled in it, said it was the strongest joint, but few knew how to do it perfectly anymore, especially without visible fasteners." His voice trailed off, lost in thought, his eyes scanning the impossible scene once more. "It's the work of a master carpenter, Father. But there is no wood here. It's as if you drove through a ghost." A ghost. He said it, and the word hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken mystery, a secular mind grappling with an undeniable spiritual truth. But it wasn't a ghost. No, it was something far more substantial, far more tangible than a specter. It was a manifestation, an intercession, a physical answer to a desperate prayer. My mind, now freed from the fog of trauma, raced back, not just to the impossible wall of timber that had momentarily appeared, but to the desperate, guttural cry that had escaped my lips in that final, terrifying fraction of a second. "Joseph, protector of the Holy Family, protect me now!" My hand, acting on pure, desperate instinct, gripping the small, smooth wooden statue on my dashboard, the sleeping carpenter of Nazareth, my mother's cherished gift when I was first ordained. Oh, how could I have been so blind, so slow to connect the threads, to accept the sheer breathtaking reality of what had transpired? The piece of wood in the trooper's hand became more than mere physical evidence. It was a sacred relic, a tangible fragment of divine intervention, a physical manifestation of a loving response. It was a piece of a promise kept, a desperate prayer answered in the most literal, direct, and extraordinary way imaginable. The carbon dating, when it finally came weeks later, would only deepen the mystery for the secular minds painstakingly studying it. Wood identified as Olea europaea, an olive tree species not native to North America, with some samples dating back an astonishing 2 millennia. 2 millennia. The lifetime of a saint, the lifetime of a carpenter, the foster father of God incarnate. I looked at Trooper Davies, his young face still etched with bewilderment, slowly yielding to a dawning, unwilling sense of the extraordinary. He saw only an inexplicable anomaly, a profound disruption of the natural order. I, however, saw the unmistakable hand of a loving God, working through his most humble and steadfast servant. I saw Saint Joseph, the silent, unassuming protector, building a barrier of eternal wood against the forces of destruction, against the despair that had so recently threatened to consume my own weary soul. My crisis of faith, which had been a slow, suffocating surrender to a quiet resignation, had been not just challenged, but utterly annihilated in an instant. The doubt, the weariness, the pervasive sense of abandonment, all of it had been crushed under the overwhelming, fragrant weight of an undeniable miracle. My eyes welled, not with tears of sadness or fear, but with an overwhelming, joyful tide of gratitude and awe. I had called out to Joseph, and Joseph, the quiet carpenter, had answered, not just with a sense of internal peace, but with a physical, tangible shield, woven from ancient wood, smelling of his workshop, imbued with his quiet strength and divine protection. The world, which should have exploded in a shower of glass and screeching metal, had yielded instead to the silent, powerful carpentry of heaven. And in that moment, standing amid the wreckage, cradling the impossible truth in my heart, I knew with a certainty that transcended all logic, all scientific explanation. I was not alone. I had never been alone. And my work, The sacred work of proclaiming his living presence in a world so desperate for signs was far from over. It was only just beginning. The notion of retirement, that carefully worded admission of defeat, vanished the moment I truly understood the miracle. My letter, sitting on the passenger seat, remained unsent, its ink now a relic of a past burdened by doubt. I returned to St. Jude's not as a defeated old man, but as a priest reborn, my spirit invigorated by an unshakable certainty of God's active, loving presence in our lives. My faith was no longer a beautiful, abstract theory. It was a tangible memory that still, sometimes, offered the faint, aromatic whisper of sawdust in the quiet corners of my mind. And I was not the only one transformed. Frank, the truck driver whose life had also been spared, now occupies the front pew every Sunday. His gruff exterior has softened. His eyes now hold a light that speaks of a faith profoundly shaken, then meticulously rebuilt, like the careful joining of two pieces of wood. My sermons are no longer hollow echoes. I speak now with a vibrant conviction of the quiet, powerful intercession of the saints, and of a loving God who will send a carpenter to construct a wall of ancient timber on a highway that might have seemed godless, all to save one of his weary priests. Miracles, I now proclaim, are not merely relics of a distant, dusty past. They are the sudden, inexplicable reassurances that we are seen, that we are heard, and that even in our darkest moments of doubt, heaven is listening, ever ready to intervene in ways that defy all earthly explanation. Our work, beloved children, is never truly done, not so long as there is breath to praise Him and a story to tell.